Welcome to the On Your Mind podcast, where we believe mental illness can be temporary and transformative. Stay tuned for innovative, effective tools from experts in the field of mental health. Hosted by Timothy J. Hayes, psychologist. This podcast aims to change the narrative around mental illness. Move from a place of fear to a place of hope and solutions. Here on Your Mind.
Emma Bragdon is the founder and executive director of Integrative Mental Health University, to be found at imhu.org. She earned her PhD in transpersonal psychology in 1987 and was licensed in California as a marriage, family, child therapist in 1988. As a pioneer who has helped define the field of spiritual emergency, Emma has published 7 books and co-produced 2 documentary films. Within IMHU, Emma has trained over 130 spiritual emergence coaches who are available to support individuals disoriented or in distress as they open to their spirituality. She also leads a small group of healthcare providers to Brazil once a year to learn about the Spiritist paradigm of mental health care from Spiritist practitioners. Emma maintains a private practice consulting internationally via Zoom. See emmabragdon.com for personal consultations or imhu.org for courses.
Well, Dr. Bragdon, thank you so much for joining us. It's a delight to see you.
Thank you for inviting me, and I'm honored to be your guest, Tim.
I'm hoping you could start us off by letting us know a little bit about how you got into the work you're doing and what drives your passion for it.
How I got into the work I'm doing? Well, the work I'm doing is being the executive director of an online university called Integrative Mental Health University. And I previously had started a foundation called the Foundation for Energy Therapies, Inc., and it was dedicated, and still is dedicated, to education as well as research. And I was inspired especially by traveling in Brazil, actually. And I was able to visit community centers and some psychiatric hospitals that are run by Spiritists. And I'll explain if your audience would like to know what that means in a minute. But the Spiritists basically have been cultivating a way of working with people that not only attends to the biological and the psychological and the community or social aspect of what might be bothering a person, but also the spiritual aspect. All 4. And I found, as I researched further, that I felt like they had a paradigm of care that was more advanced than ours, and they've been cultivating it since the late 19th century, which means that they've been through a lot of phases of development, and they've kept what works. And so I wanted to expose this to the rest of the world outside of Brazil. In fact, give people the opportunity to visit and see with their own eyes and experience what I had experienced. But I also wanted to bring that paradigm to the United States, not necessarily under the name of Spiritism. Like, I'm not looking for followers.
Right.
I'm not looking to create a new religion at all or a cult or anything like that. But the paradigm of bringing spirituality into mental health care seems extremely important to me after what I've seen. And thankfully, there's a lot of research going on now that will say to us that, for instance, meditators who practice meditation quite devotedly, meaning every day, are in better health. And in fact, their brains actually take a different shape. They're much less prone to depression. So we are moving into an area where it's quite well known that spiritual practices can enhance mental health if done in the appropriate way with some guidance. So what I'm bringing to this is timely. It's just another voice coming from a somewhat different angle, but also working with the people, the scientists, the researchers who are doing such wonderful work these days around what are the components of human flourishing. So at IMHU, our university, we're right in line with that new research and wanting to bring more of it to the international public. So we have 46 courses, and there's a lot that we're doing, both for people who are experiencing difficulties in their mental health, some distress, but also, and more so, we want to help the healthcare providers, psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, coaches, to fill in the gaps of their own education. Because it is really quite recent that we've made this turn to decide that spirituality is actually can be an important component of mental health care.
Right.
And so those people who were educated prior to the last 5 years, let's say, didn't learn much about this in their graduate school training or in their postgraduate school training. And so we hope to fill in some of the gaps of that. And I guess I'm answering more than your initial question. What brought me to this was getting inspired in Brazil by what I saw, but also I have a doctorate in transpersonal psychology, which also dovetails spirituality to some extent into mental health care.
Excellent. Well, as I'm reading through the book Spiritism and Mental Health, is that the title?
Yes.
One of the things that you talk about so clearly is some of the evidence for our consciousness or our awareness that being other than just the byproduct of random neural firings, as Evan Alexander used to believe. And you are reading and citing research, and the Spiritist movement does research around how people are aware of things that they wouldn't be able to be aware of if their consciousness was simply tied to brain functioning, which we can track. So we have people who've had near-death experiences or death experiences and come back from them. And during a period of time where we're monitoring their brain functioning and finding nothing that could support any evidence of consciousness or life, people come back from that and have a memory of what happened while they were, quote, gone. So if there is something there that's more than just the physical body, and all we're treating with our mental health work is the physical body or the logical part of it, we're missing vast expanses of who we are as people and what might be contributing to what we say are our problems.
Yeah, we're on the same page. And given what we're finding through, for instance, research around human flourishing, it's very clear that there is this wide expanse of more potential, human potential, and we're being able to put names to it now, not just say, well, we're only using 10% of our brain function, but we're able to say, hey, there are other senses, and maybe we've gathered them all under that name of intuition before. But even intuition has had a bad name because it's becoming a bit more acceptable. We can talk about experiences, not only general people, but neuroscientists and neurosurgeons like Eben Alexander, who you quoted. They are having experiences, and it's leading them to question what we've thought before, and it's leading them to expand their whole notion of what's possible. And I think Dr. Eben Alexander's actually shifted his life so that he's teaching people how to move into these expanded states without having to die clinically.
Right.
It's a wonderful piece of work to be assisting people to moving into these other states of consciousness to expand their potential.
So help me remember the word you used for our mental state of, did you say flourishing?
Flourishing. Correct.
I love that.
Yes.
Just this morning, as I was driving to work, on the radio before it could kick over to the book on tape I was listening to, I heard an advertisement for a medication. And the insanity of this, I wouldn't go deep into the insanity of it, but I want to key into one thing. Their advertisement on the radio for a medication to help suppress my symptoms of tardive dyskinesia. In other words,
Oh,
uncontrolled
yes.
shaking movements, etc. And the woman who's saying, I'm so glad I found this medication. and then they say, here's the good news. Well, with all these other side effects or other main effects that are ugly you don't want. Here's the good news. You can still take this while you're taking your other mental health medicines, they said. And that phrase just struck me. This is not about mental health, right? And so instead of talking about just suppressing symptoms, you're talking about helping people move into a state of flourishing.
Correct.
And I don't want to just be on the sidelines cheering you on. I want to be out there in the field with you promoting that. That's a marvelous thing.
Oh, great. Well, I'm happy to have you be a partner in that. That's great. And it's going to take a really big team. So if this is relatively new label for you,
I just
you
love the word, right? The idea that I can stay, instead of saying, well, it's mental health, it's been co-opted in so many different ways. I want to talk, this is about flourishing as a person. This is that whole picture of you as a person. You labeled 4 different areas, right? But you can cut it up into 12 or 15, but it's not just, I got enough food, I got enough sleep, I got enough water, I got enough air to breathe. It's a lot more to having a life that is flourishing.
right. And flourishing implies that someone is really happy. You know, they feel satisfied. They have a sense of purpose in their life, and their work and their life is aligned with their sense of purpose. It gives them meaning. It's not just about the very important material things you just talked about, like enough food on the table and maybe physical health and a dry and warm house in the wintertime, a dry and not so warm house in the summertime. It's not so much about that as it is about also uh, meaning, purpose, and community. And actually, what's being added to this is also the importance of environment. So that doesn't mean that one has to live in the forest because it's beautiful or near a lake. And if you don't live near a lake, then you're in bad luck. But it means an environment that's safe and perhaps uplifting in some way. And for some people, that will be a city. And for others, like me, it'll be more closer to nature. But environment can also be important. But the whole concept of human flourishing is actually being very much explored at the Program for Human Flourishing at Harvard University. And in fact, they are, to my delight, I found out that they're doing a collaborative work with some of my colleagues in Brazil. Alexander Moreira Almeida is one of the most well-known researchers who happens to be Spiritist, and he happens to be Brazilian, living in Brazil, teaching there as psychiatrist. And he has made good connections with the people at Human Flourishing, the program at Harvard. And so there will be a global conference in May. I think it's May 14th and 15th in the Boston area. And actually in March, McLean Hospital, with I think another organization, is also sponsoring a similar kind of conversation, looking at spirituality and religion as an important component of mental health care. So there are 2 opportunities for people like you and me, and maybe some of your listeners, to really look deeply into this focus on spirituality and religion and mental health care towards human flourishing. It's very much part of research right now, fabulous research, as well as international conversation. So I'm thrilled because IMHU fits right in here. We hope to also be part of the conference and offering a program. We'll see if that works. But nonetheless, there are going to be some wonderful people attending and offering as part of the program.
Excellent. Well, I know that we've got at least two or three things to come back to. One, before I forget, you had mentioned the idea of other ways to perceive, other than maybe just the five very solid, gross, you might say, senses. And David E. Martin wrote the book, Lizards Eat Butterflies. And in it, he explores the idea that if we have 12 cranial nerves, and we've got 5 of them that go directly to our 5 senses, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, etc., what are the other 7 for? And what if we've missed the boat? What if each of the other 7 cranial nerves provide us ways to experience life or take in information, and we're just not trained into the sensitivity to them, or we've been conditioned away from the sensitivity to them? So that was a point that I wanted to put out here. If you don't know about his book or his efforts to explore the other 7 cranial nerves and ways to interact with the world, that might be of interest to you. The other thing was, can you give us a simple definition for the difference between spiritual and spiritist?
Yes. In fact, I'd like to start there. I mentioned that I became very interested in Spiritism, and that was in 2001. And as a person with a doctorate in transpersonal psychology, when I ran into it, and I recognized that about 1/5 of the population of Brazil attends Spiritist centers, I thought, why haven't I heard about this? Was I asleep? And then when I came back to this country, the United States, I realized most people know nothing about it.
Exactly.
So here we go. Back in the 1850s and 60s, an educator who used the pen name Allan Kardec thought he'd take a look into what was popular in Paris at the time. He was a Frenchman. And what was popular was seances. People getting together and seeing if they could contact the spirits in some way to help them along in their life or to gain more perspective about what's going on planet Earth. At first, he thought, this isn't going to lead to anything. And then he started realizing, no, wait a minute, it is leading to something. And like a very well-disciplined educator, he set up a whole body of questions and then would ask a lot of different mediums who were well-respected in their day to answer questions. For instance, what's the meaning of life? Why are we here? How do we make life a very satisfying and fulfilling experience for us? What is the interaction that spirits have with human beings? What happens to us after we die? Etc., etc. And so he collated the answers that he got that were similar from different mediums who didn't know each other. And out of that, to make a long story short, came 5 books. This was Paris, right? In the middle of the 19th century. And there were Brazilian students who came from wealthy families who were getting educated at universities in Paris. They brought the books back to Brazil, and it seemed to be very fertile ground because Spiritism wants to facilitate evolution, spiritual evolution. And spirituality in itself, or spiritualism, oftentimes just looks at the phenomena, as in, wow, look at that, tipping tables. Wow, look at that. Someone just seemed to be playing a guitar, even though the guitar was on the other side of the room, and they had no physical touch with it. So there are all kinds of manifestations people can become very fascinated with around spiritualism. But Spiritism itself was oriented towards spiritual evolution. And towards that end, they also developed ways to assist people to become more physically healthy through attending to the subtle levels of their body structure. For instance, through our study of Eastern philosophy, most of us recognize now that there are meridians of the body that acupuncturists attend to. or we recognize there are chakras, which are energy centers of the body that are connected to certain organs of the body, usually thought of as being connected to certain organs. But there's also the aura that can become congested, even though it is a subtle aspect of the body that we don't physically see and can't be really physically measured in a scientific way. So the spiritists will attend to that level, the more subtle level of being a human being, and where there is, as an example, congestion in the auric field of a person, or congestion in the chakras or the energy centers of the body, some of the techniques that have evolved in Spiritism can actually clear that congestion. And that has a very important impact on improving physical and mental health. So I just named one particular technique that's used, but that technique is used in all Spiritist centers. It's a form of energy medicine or energy work, some people call it. Some people think of it as being very similar to Reiki, which has become quite popular in the United States. But the Spiritists use that very frequently and for free, offering it. And it's one of the most popular things that is offered through the Spiritist centers, because most of our doctors, nurses, and all who are trained in a biomedical system can attend to allopathic care, but they won't attend to the subtle body or the spiritual aspect of a person. And that's where Spiritism comes in to help. And so it is not a replacement for allopathic care. It is more an adjunct or something that complements allopathic care. So there's no conflict at all. It's only offering more the subtle and spiritual aspect of health and healing to people for free through Spiritist centers and Spiritist psychiatric hospitals.
Well, and as I understand it, the fundamental approach of Spiritism is to look systemically at the whole person at physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, etc. levels for realignment or establishing a flow, or to help the system heal itself, rather than simply, in the medical model we have here in the US, we're into symptom suppression. And I remember a number of years ago listening to an interview with Dr. Mark Hyman, and he said, listen, it isn't rocket science to figure out what it takes to live a healthy, loving human life. And then we would list the same kind of things we just listed, right? It's this, people have known for a long time, if they've slowed down and thought about it, that while it helps some scientists think about the body in terms of it's a machine and we can take out somebody's kidney and put it in somebody else, et cetera. But that analogy only goes so far. And there's a lot more going on here than just the physical. And if you can have a system like Spiritism that acknowledges that and starts working with these other aspects in conjunction with the physical and the mental, the emotional, the social, and the
Yes.
relationship work, it's
Yes.
just, it's, those of us who've worked in this field understand how much more effective that can be.
Yes. Thank you. Again, we're on the same page.
And it happens without all the negative effects that come from just suppressing symptoms.
Yes. And most of the Spiritists, they don't have an attitude against psychiatric medication, but the Spiritist hospitals that I have visited, and there have been several of them, take a more moderate approach. In fact, I was just in Brazil in November 2025, and one of the psychiatrists who was in the position of teaching us and said, what we try to do is, if we're using psychiatric medication, is use it only up to a certain point where someone can still feel their connection to God. I've never heard that from anyone.
Exactly. Exactly. I've never heard that from, as a matter of fact, just this week in one of my sessions, a patient reported to me that the psychiatrist said to them, you are going to need to take this medication for depression just like somebody who needs insulin for diabetes. Now, there's no scientific basis of that I've ever been aware of from studies. It's been disproven many, many times, and yet it's still being given as verbiage to patients as though this is the truth.
Well, I've felt upset about that, and maybe you have too, Tim. And then I have to realize, well, I look back at my graduate school education, which happened in the 1980s, and some of the doctors who are now in a position of offering advice to people also had education back, let's say, in the 80s or 90s, when they were taught that, hey, psychiatric medication is really the thing we are looking for.
It's here. It's answered our prayers. We're all set.
Right. It's it. And so they aren't so apt to look at some of the research that's saying, no, we've got to look elsewhere. That's not happening. We don't anymore have our faith in it being a chemical that we need to look for. There's something else. And
there are a lot of something else's.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on for an
There's a lot
individual.
of something else's. So, shall I get back to that other question you were talking about? And unfortunately, I have not read the book that you told me. I love the title of it, but I'm so immersed in some of the other things I'm doing. I haven't been reading as much, but I can attend to the question you asked.
It isn't necessary that you read the book. It's just an affirmation that there are a lot of good minds, maybe not the majority of them, but there are some good minds out there saying, hey, look, there's a lot more going on here than just the physical. And one of those people is David E. Martin. And the book was Lizards Eat Butterflies. And while he is, if I understand correctly, he's still moving on, having gatherings with people, trying to do experiential exercises to expand their awareness and perhaps gain greater facility with or experience of, conscious awareness of, what are the other senses that might be tied to these 7 cranial nerves that are there they exist in us, just like the 5 cranial nerves that feed the eyes and the ears and the nose and the mouth, etc.
Great question. And thank you. I've written down to read that particular book. But I will say that's part of what has me fascinated about the Spiritists is that they do have a number of people who were doing research. One person comes to mind who actually did write a chapter in the book Spiritism and Mental Health. And he was doing research, he probably still is, on the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is very active in those people who are especially sensitive in being able to contact the intuition. So we can call them mediums. That's what they're called in Brazil. And I'm not here to say that everyone who calls himself a medium is 100% accurate. There are a lot of people who have possibly very strong intuition who aren't necessarily accurate all the time. And it is extremely difficult, if you have the gift of intuition, to be accurate all the time. So within Spiritism, they actually train mediums, in other words, people who have a very strong intuition. They train them so that they can have the most accuracy possible, and they only work in teams so that there's always a supervisor there who will be helpful for someone if they start moving in the direction of not being accurate and needing some time out. But if we just take the notion that it is possible to get information about another person without ever meeting them and only hearing possibly their name and possibly knowing that they live 3,000 miles away, that a medium who is well-trained and profoundly gifted can come up with a lot of accurate information about where that person actually lives, what some of their problems might be on a physical level, what some of their emotional issues might be, and what they might need to do in order to reclaim a higher ability to manifest health. So that kind of work is quite extraordinary. I don't expect everyone to manifest that in life. But just the very fact that some people are highly trained and highly gifted mediums can help us to see that, yes, there is something within us as human beings that we call intuition, that can give us information outside of our physical knowing. In other words, we don't need to use our five senses in order to validate that it's true. So the use of mediums in terms of in Spiritism, these highly developed mediums to actually help with diagnosis and in some cases prognosis in terms of what's going to be the future for this person, and be on board to really assist psychiatrists to complement the way the psychiatrist will look at someone who's really in distress. That's been a tremendous amplification of the ability to be helpful for a person. And not only is that just helpful, but it can be transformative. So, do we have time for me to tell a little story, Tim?
Please.
Okay. So this story had a big impact on me, and I tell it not because it's the most unique story in the world, but because it tells very graphically what can happen and what has happened to a number of people that I have met in Brazil. So this fellow has given me permission to tell his story. His first name is Marcelo. I call him Marcelo. And at 28, he was a happy guy. So he enjoyed his work, he enjoyed his circle of friends, he had a good relationship with his parents, he had no significant trauma in his life. Things were rolling along pretty well. But he had some depression. And his parents, both of them quite well to do because his father was a banker high up in the organization, sent him to one of the best psychiatrists in Sao Paulo. And the guy said, I think antidepressants is the way to go. So Marcelo complied, but he started feeling worse. And he started to hear voices, sometimes 5 or 6 at the same time, all not making sense. And so this was extremely upsetting for him. And he also felt sensations in his body that he hadn't felt before, that he would say it felt like something was crawling over my body. And so he would develop this way of trying to brush them off his body. So to a conventionally trained nurse, psychiatrist, psychologist, someone would say, well, those are all, symptoms that he's probably psychotic and possibly schizophrenic. Well, back he went, but with his parents' advice to the psychiatrist, and yes, he was put into a psychiatric hospital and given antipsychotics. And unfortunately, he kept feeling worse. And there was no noticeable change in terms of his feeling better. So at that point, his parents removed him from the psych hospital. And after a period of time, which they hoped would help him just relax and feel better, that he was admitted in a Spiritist psychiatric hospital. And they went through what anyone would go through in one of our best psychiatric hospitals, which is being seen by a social worker, having a medical checkup. And so you really notice what the stresses are on this particular person. And then he was also seen by a medical intuitive. In other words, someone who had these highly developed and well-trained intuitive skills. And that person realized that Marcelo was a energy healer in the rough, as it were. In other words, he needed training. He needed to harness his abilities. So at this particular hospital in Palmelo, Brazil, there was a community, a Spiritist community around the hospital, which also gave trainings so that people like Marcelo, who were gifted, could learn how to do the energy work and could also be an apprentice to someone who could channel higher knowledge from highly evolved spirits. So I realize this can sound very, very odd to some people.
Yep.
But on the other hand, it will sound like a real possibility to others. And this is in partial answer to what are these other gifts that we have that we aren't using? So anyway, Marcelo was in the hospital for a month while he was actually withdrawing also from the antipsychotics and
Right.
beginning to get training. And then within a few months, he was out of the hospital, not because he'd run away, but because he no longer needed to be there. But he was living in the community, continuing to take training, and under supervision, going back into the psychiatric hospital to do energy work with the patients. So it really put into a nutshell parts of stories that I had been able to hear firsthand from people who had also been diagnosed as psychotic or schizophrenic, had gone to Spiritism for guidance and help, and because they were gifted, had turned their life around. In fact, I'm thinking about one man who was told he was schizophrenic, need to be on medication, antipsychotics for the rest of his life. He went into Spiritism, learned more about his intuition and about these other abilities that he had, learned how to harness them, and is now teaching physics in a university
Excellent.
without any antipsychotics.
Right.
So by not looking at some of these potentials that people have, for instance, with intuition or with energy work, like Marcelo has a gift in that, by not looking at that, we sometimes misdiagnose people who might be showing up with some very odd kind of behaviors, like Marcelo, hearing 5 or 6 voices and having the sense that rodents were on his arms and legs. We might be misdiagnosing them and just saying categorically, oh, this looks like psychosis. Oh, this looks like schizophrenia. This person needs antipsychotics. And in fact, a person may need something for a while to attend to the anxiety they feel. Like Marcelo was calling himself crazy. The only way he could perceive what was going on in himself was, I'm a crazy person.
Nobody else I know has these hearings and these sightings and these feelings, so it must be that I'm right. The thing I want to point out is what you're saying is not only are we misdiagnosing, we're actually suppressing the energies that, as your story identifies, if we can train and teach people how to be aware of those energies, sometimes allow them, sometimes use them, then they flourish, to come back to the word we want to use, flourishing as a human.
Well, not only are they flourishing, but if we again embroider on Marcelo's story, he is in a position now to be helping other people.
Exactly.
So his gifts are actually in service to the community. And that gives a whole other perspective. And so, in fact, we are taking some people who may have the same kinds of symptoms, we call them, as Marcelo, and telling them they need to take medication for the rest of their life and that they should absolutely consider that they have a very simple life that is non-stressed and not working with other people so much because they can't take the stress. And so we kind of remove them from community.
And we steal from the community that energy, which can be so helpful and healing.
As well as stealing from that person that they're a gifted individual that needs just to learn and get some training.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The thing that, in the beginning of your talking about that, the thought that came to my mind was, why don't we hear more about Spiritism here? Something you've said once or twice already in this call. Spiritists don't charge. Just let that sink in. How is that going to fit in this model? What if you've got something that's really effective at helping people and then you can't make a dime at it? How are you going to encourage that, encourage people to start schools and institutions that in this culture where almost everything comes down to the bottom line of how much are we making in terms of money, and our healthcare system being profit driven. It's a real problem, and it creates problems for us to deal with.
That's a really good thing to bring into the conversation as far as I'm concerned. And I have been ruminating about this, now for 25 years. Like, can Spiritism possibly fit into the American culture? Because it is a paradigm of care that is so far advanced from what we have, from my perspective. And certainly that's a stumbling block. Spiritists don't charge anything for what they give. But, if it is to come into the United States, I think it will come in because of the conversations going on now about human flourishing and the desire to improve our medical healthcare system and our mental healthcare system, which are clearly showing signs of not working very well right now. So I think Spiritism will come to people's attention through that avenue. And if we create a Spiritist center that does charge something, that won't be the end of the world. It'll simply be Americanizing something, and it may, not function exactly like what happens in Brazil with exactly the same kind of outcomes, but it's a step in the right direction. And I don't think that it would be helpful for any of us to say, well, we can't bring it to the United States because it's free.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that one of the things that may have suppressed it and actively at an unconscious or conscious level might be that, this country seems really devoted to the deity of money, right? That we got to
Yeah.
have the almighty dollar and we've got to be making more. And so anyway, I don't want to go down the path too far. I just wanted to mention it because it came up, right? There's this wonderful aspect of the work you've been experiencing in Brazil, which is it's kind of the antidote to people over here that get taken advantage of. And they have
Mhm.
somebody that tells them, listen, give me $400 and I'll burn a candle on my shrine and it will, cure your
Arthritis.
negative spirits or your arthritis. And I've had people come through my caseload over the past 51 and a half years of doing therapy they pay more money to those people than they do to see me in therapy.
Yeah.
And they're just getting, taken advantage of. Whereas in the Spiritist movement, where they offer what they're doing without requirement for payment or even a suggested donation, it removes that factor. And so you have this purity of intent and hopefully purity of response and result because it's just people connecting, trying to help each other
Oh, well said.
as whole people.
Beautifully said. And, in tribute around religious institutions, there are people who volunteer and give wholeheartedly.
Well, I think aside from the money, I think that's the biggest part of any good religion is the you might call some people call them ministries that develop within the church community.
Yes. Yeah. So I'd like to mention two things,
Please,
if
please
you would
do.
let me. One is Spiritism is sometimes misconceived as a religion. It is not. It's a path of life which can lead to evolution, spiritual evolution, similar to something like Omega Institute or Esalen Institute, which are dedicated to human growth. That's more in line with what it is. So it's not a religion, it's not a cult. The other thing I wanted to say is that something that I've been profoundly focused on since 1980 is the notion of spiritual emergence and spiritual emergency. And these two terms were coined by a psychiatrist, Stan Grof, and his wife, Christina Grof. And they recognized some people are having profound spiritual experiences and they are not being perceived for what they're having. They're being misperceived and often misdiagnosed. Marcelo is an example of that. He was having spiritual experiences and initially he was misdiagnosed. But other people are having different kinds of experiences, and some of them can be like a near-death experience. as you were mentioning earlier. But we have not trained our psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors, coaches to understand what a spiritual experience is, how to support it so a person can evolve spiritually. In other words, continue to move on to higher and higher or more expanded states of consciousness. And we also haven't helped recognize what a spiritual emergency is. So think of Marcelo again. And when he first started having these strange things going on, he was very disoriented and he thought, well, the only thing that's going on here is that I'm nuts. And so he called himself crazy. But actually, as he became more educated and trained, he realized he was not crazy. He needed and some psych education, actually, as well as training. So we need to bring that knowingness of spiritual emergence and emergency to people who are in positions of coaching and counseling and giving psychiatric care. And that means at this point, hopefully in the future, we'll move into graduate schools. But at this point, IMHU, what I founded and now run, Integrative Mental Health University, offers training for coaches, counselors, psychologists, offers continuing education they can get to learn how to recognize spiritual experiences, learn how to support spiritual awakening or spiritual emergence, and learn how to be supportive of someone in a spiritual crisis or spiritual emergency so that they can have the same kind of positive transformation that Marcelo experienced. That doesn't mean that everyone's going to turn into an energy worker or they're going to turn into a channeler or something. It might just mean that someone moves from being a person who is a little confused into a person who's profoundly satisfied with their life. So IMHU is trying to fill in the gaps of education that people who went to medical school or graduate school in psychology or nursing school or coaching just did not get. So we are offering that. And that's been a major part of my work in the world.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I recognize, I'm looking at the time, there's 4 or 5 things I wanted to talk about. I had picked up my phone to read a section of your book that talks about how the energies that we're talking about move faster than the speed of light, and there's research on that, et cetera. However, because of time limitations, let me ask you to get centered and take a breath and think about what we've covered so far. And is there a part of it you want to go back and highlight, or is there something else that we haven't even touched on yet about your work or the IMHU that you want to bring forward in this talk?
Thanks for asking. So, Tim, one thing I'm working on right now is launching a new course that will be for youth. Because from where I sit, there clearly, as in the major media, is telling us that adolescents, meaning teenagers and people who are young adults, are really having a lot of problems. Mental health crisis is the word for it. And so I've been looking more closely into, well, what is going on and what might they need? And I think actually some of what I can call the younger generation, because of my elder years, the younger generation, many of them are highly sensitive and more in touch with these other aspects of the self, including intuition, than some of the elders are. And they have very little knowledge about how to deal with it. And sometimes they just feel, frankly, overwhelmed and alone and often isolate. And that can lead to some deep psychological issues. So, along with someone who has been a clinical psychologist who was taught at Cornell for 22 years and specifically oriented around young people who have a tendency to hurt themselves, cut on themselves, possibly have suicidal ideation. We have created a course that will be empowering for young people so that they can learn some of these aspects of spirituality, in other words, the other parts of themselves they may need to get acquainted with, as well as learn how to manage when they have psychological upsets. So it's basically, by title, Empowering Youth to Navigate Extreme States. And that will be launched in the next few days
Excellent.
through IMHU. So, and the site name to get to it is imhu.org. If you think of the first four letters of I'm Human, it's imhu.org. We are a nonprofit charitable organization.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, I would ask the permission to reach out to you again in the not too distant future and have another conversation, because as I'm working my way through the book, Spiritism and Mental Health, I can already see that we got to almost a tiny fraction of what I was hoping we could talk about today, with some of the deeper understandings of the observations and the science that's going into the Spiritist movement. So I thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today, and thank you for the work you're doing.
I appreciate the acknowledgement, Tim, and thank you for your interest, and it's an honor to be on your show.
Blessings.
Emma Bragdon is the founder and executive director of Integrative Mental Health University, to be found at imhu.org. She earned her PhD in transpersonal psychology in 1987 and was licensed in California as a marriage, family, child therapist in 1988. As a pioneer who has helped define the field of spiritual emergency, Emma has published 7 books and co-produced 2 documentary films. Within IMHU, Emma has trained over 130 spiritual emergence coaches who are available to support individuals disoriented or in distress as they open to their spirituality. She also leads a small group of healthcare providers to Brazil once a year to learn about the Spiritist paradigm of mental health care from Spiritist practitioners. Emma maintains a private practice consulting internationally via Zoom. See emmabragdon.com for personal consultations or imhu.org for courses.
You've been listening to the On Your Mind podcast, offered by Journey's Dream, where we support people through mental health challenges to a place of true and lasting well-being. If you love our show, we invite you to visit onyourmindpodcast.org to join the conversation, access the show notes, and discover our helpful resources. Thank you for listening.